So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Rashik Zaman, Senior Account Manager at Peterberry Consultancy, and I'll be your host today as we talk about the power of perspective, combining personality and 360 feedback for leadership development. It's also my pleasure to introduce Lee Wallace, Head of Coaching and Development at PwC.
Thanks so much, Rashik, and welcome everybody. It's really lovely to be joining you today, Rashik, and I'm so looking forward to taking you all through today's case study, where we get to see how enriched a leader's experience can be when we have access to both these really great data assets. Many of you may have heard the phrase that Bob Hogan coined some time back when he said, "Give me the private person, as in the personality and below the waterline, as well as the public person, as in the 360 and above the waterline, and they've got nowhere to hide." So really looking forward to today. Thanks, Rashik.
Thanks, Lee. So what we'll do today is go over the impact of leadership on performance, talk a little bit about strategic self-awareness for leadership development, and then the real star of the show is the case study, The Power of Perspective, which Lee will run through. So our research shows that leadership drives engagement and performance. The leader has 70% of the impact on a team, and the leadership team has 50% impact on the workforce. So engagement can be measured by surveys and employee retention, and engagement pays. So ultimately, leadership is inherently linked to the business outcomes of an organization. A little bit of research from Gallup that speaks to the importance of leadership on a team and really talks to how leadership directly impacts the top line and the bottom line of a business, including revenue, sales growth, customer retention, net promoter scores, productivity, and employee retention. So we know that leadership effectiveness is important, but how do we measure and improve it? Well, a solid foundation is to use evidence-based and technically validated assessments, such as Hogan Personality, Hogan 360, and high-performing team assessments to inform development. But the question is, why use those assessments? Well, the power of perspective and gaining strategic self-awareness is what is really powerful for leadership development. And we can look at a holistic insight of the what and the why. So the what being behaviors observable at a point in time, and the why being the underlying personality and behavioral preferences that drive the what for an individual. So in terms of measuring the why, well, we can use the Hogan personality assessments, which most of you should be familiar with, but just as a quick refresher, the HPI being the bright side or the day-to-day strengths, the HDS being the dark side or the strengths when overused can become derailers or obstacles to success, and the MVPI being the key drivers and motivations for an individual and speaking more to organizational fit as well. In terms of the what, how do we actually measure that? Well, a 360 tool, we believe, is one of the best ways to measure that what. And there are a lot of 360 tools available on the market. We obviously have the Hogan 360. So again, some of you may be familiar with the Hogan 360, but for those that are not, it is a multi-rater 360 tool that gathers feedback from managers, self-evaluation, peers, stakeholders, and reports. It has rate on scale, ranking, and open-ended questions. You'll see a little bit more detail during the case study with Lee, and it's benchmarked globally. The model that it utilizes is based on 4 quadrants of self-management, relationship management, working in the business, and working on the business. So why the Hogan 360 when there's so many different options available on the market and also people considering making their own 360s within organizations? Well, we have this ready to go, and there's a freely available technical manual that we're happy to share that demonstrates the reliability and validity of the tool. The rate on scale questions actually have a 7-point scale, which gives greater resolution to capture the nuance of people's responses. It's globally benchmarked, as mentioned before, but it's across industry, sectors, job levels, and you can also see the quartile percentile. So when looking at someone's report, they can actually evaluate where they sit on that global benchmark, and it really gives a good window of, where the improvement needs to happen. There are unique strengths and opportunities tables which accurately inform the development planning and coaching.
And Rashik, if you wouldn't mind me just jumping in there for a moment, I absolutely love that differentiator of the Hogan 360, because in my experience of coaching leaders, and I don't know how the audience feels about this, but for the most part, I feel like many of us are pretty self-critical, and I often find that, leaders jump into the opportunities to improve, what are the less desirable behaviors possibly coming out through the 360, where are my areas for development, without really taking some time to really appreciate and value the strengths that they could also leverage to enhance performance. So I love the fact that the 360 is structured in a way that the report, that the design builds. So you're getting all these sections, one building upon the other, to really have a clear, informed view of one's strengths and opportunities as observed by others. So there's a really nice balance view, which I love.
Thanks, Lee. And then we have customization options. So our Hogan 360 can be mapped to a client's capability framework. There are options for additional item banks and also branding customization as well, to start to incorporate the icons and language of your organization. And then there's the value for money. So it's competitively priced, but not only that, there's no ongoing costs for utilizing the platform, and it's a free of charge online certification process as well for those organizations that want to have people internally qualified to be able to debrief the tool. So there's no additional cost, it's just utilizing the report. Now, of course, we're focused on individual leadership development in this session, but there are many other applications for the 360 beyond that can be utilized as well, such as for succession planning and developing high potential, looking at resolving dysfunctional executive teams, analysis on a cohort or even organization-wide analysis, which we offer, and measuring ROI of development programs. So, it could be a development program that maybe doesn't utilize any tools, and you can utilize a 360 after that development program to see where those individuals rank, or even better, doing a 360 before the program and then doing a 360 at some point after, maybe 6 to 12 months after, to really measure how much the needle has moved, and then you can measure the ROI of that program. Now, we've already seen how managers account for 70% of the variance in engagement. Well, at PBC, we believe that 360s are the best way to measure the impact of the manager. And when we look at the impact of 360s on organizations that use them regularly, we see that they have a direct relationship with improved business outcomes. Some of those being retention of high potential employees, better decision-making, a decrease in employee turnover, and an increase in customer satisfaction. And this data actually comes from a recent panel discussion that PBC took part in at the Annual Society for Industrial Organizational Psychologists. It was in May 2023. And in that panel, they cited these examples of the benefits seen by organizations that use 360s regularly. Now, a key part of leadership development or any individual's development is coaching. And CoachSource states that the results show 92% of organizations use a 360 survey feedback tool, and 71% actually use Hogan personality assessments.
And jumping in here again, if you don't mind, Rashik, I love this slide, because when we talk about coaching interventions and how we often frame up the powerful combination of personality and 360 is in fact in the what and the why. And I find when you are explaining it to the individual in that way, using the what and the why, it really resonates with them in terms of the 360 being the what. What are people saying about me? What are people's observations of my behaviors in the workplace? What are people's perceptions of my leadership effectiveness and impact? And helping the individual to unpack the what is invariably the why, which is the personality. What are some of those innate personality characteristics that are showing up in a way that people are observing. Sometimes more desirably so, and other times less desirably so. So really just using that what and why language seems to really resonate with individuals.
Thanks, Lee. So combining personality and 360 data provides, as Lee was mentioning, a rich and powerful insight into an individual. So in your experience, Lee, are there any actual common connections or combinations or correlations that you see between an individual's 360 profile and their personality profile in your coaching experience?
Absolutely, Rashik. And for many of you who are Hogan certified, that you may have come across in the interpretation guide, at the back of the interpretation guide, there's actually reference to the correlations between the Hogan personality and the Hogan 360. So if you don't have access to that, certainly reach out sort of following the webinar. But, you know, there are a number of sort of common connections or combinations, and a few that sort of stand out for me from my experience would be looking at, for example, the HPI. Something like adjustment has a very strong connection to resilience, which falls under the self-management domain as a sub-theme there. Often you see a strong connection between efficiency, which sits under working in the business, and your prudence scale on the HPI. There might be a very good connection as well between that relationship management component, particularly the people skills sub-theme, with things like interpersonal sensitivity. Looking at, you know, the MVPI, looking at something like affiliation, that often plays out in a good connection with the team player sub-theme under relationship management. We might also expect to see, you know, your inquisitive and imaginative scales on both the HDS and also the HPI may play into that strategy or innovation sub-theme in working on the business. So certainly some very strong correlations, and there's some really neat sort of unpacking and information of that in the guide.
Thanks, Lee. Looking forward to the insights from the case study now. That's a little bit of a teaser, theoretical teaser to what's to come, I'm sure. And then zooming back out in terms of conceptually, we say that, you know, we believe personality is not fate. So a quote by Bob Hogan, he says that by combining Hogan 360 data with Hogan personality assessment data, we compare the public person with the private person to build strategic self-awareness and career success. So it's really understanding the why and the what that allows an individual to drive behavior choices to improve their performance and to improve their outcomes. So how others see us being the what measured by the 360, core personality being the why measured by the Hogan personality. And then once we have an individual has that holistic understanding, it really empowers them, often with the assistance of a coach and their manager, to make better behavior choices to then improve the performance. So let's take a quick breather to answer any questions that we might have so far.
We've had a couple come through from the chat. We're looking into getting a bit more current research on that coach source stat about the Hogan tools and the rate that they're being used at increasingly. So that was one that we'll come back to Jen on. We had a question from Kathleen around the global benchmark and whether this is sort of stratified across different demographics. And maybe one for Lee.
Yes, very good question. And that global benchmark is made up of professionals across industry and also across levels. So at that global benchmark is certainly not industry or level specific.
Awesome. Thank you. And then another question to either of you, just to talk to what the 360 qualification, how that looks and what's involved in that process.
I'm happy to.
Oh, you go, Lee. You go, Lee.
Sorry, Rashik, just the
That's
one thing I wanted to add to the
Mm.
global benchmark is, if anybody on this call is looking for specific benchmarks relative to an industry or a specific level, certainly, engage our team in those conversations because there are, multiple benchmarks available as well. Over to you, Rashik.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Lee. And in terms of the qualification process, there are two options. So there's a self webinar online qualification process that you can do. The other option is actually to join a group workshop online to get your qualifications. So both of those are available on our website. If you'd like more information, just reach out to us directly and we can definitely point you in the right direction in terms of whichever option is more convenient for you. Would encourage, if you're able to join the workshop because it's a little bit more interactive and engaging and we've had really good reviews from those that have attended.
Thank you. Could probably kick on after that.
Yeah, great. Well, now that that's done, over to the best part, Lee, the main event, case study.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Rashik. And at this point, for those of you who haven't had a chance to have a look at the profile of Sarah's sample that we're using for the case study, we're going to have our team just pop the flash report as well as the 360 into the chat for your convenience and easy access, as well as also some of the scale definitions for those of you who may not be as familiar with the Hogan personality inventory. So let's get started. Firstly, I wanted to introduce you to Sarah Sample, obviously de-identified for the purposes of this case study. But Sarah, she's an electrical engineer by trade and is managing a team of about 6 direct reports and has been doing so for about 5 years. She hasn't undergone any previous formal 360 process, hasn't had any any exposure to any personality assessment data either. So a new experience for Sarah. And along the way, she has got a bit of feedback from previous supervisors, alluding to a very strong work ethic. She's got some good attention to detail and very focused on results. So Sarah was nominated by her manager for this particular leadership development program. And what was on offer was 6 one-on-one coaching sessions. And part of the program included both the Hogan personality inventory as well as the Hogan 360. So a really robust program, sort of spanning around sort of 6 months, also including a bit of executive sponsor meetings by her manager, just to all align on the where to from here. So before we dive into the data, just a very brief reminder in terms of sort of the feedback process. What we do know is that in the absence of really good self-awareness, assessment data can sometimes be quite confronting for some, particularly if you're not often getting feedback or you're not eliciting feedback. That's why we would recommend starting with personality, then following that with the 360, as personality is self-reported and it's really aimed at deepening one's insight into their likely work behaviors and drivers before moving into getting and gaining a real insight into perceptions of others in relation to their style and effectiveness. Of course, it's really important to create that psychological safety in the coaching environment, to really refrain from judgment, and very important to unpack context. What is working well for Sarah? What isn't working well? What does she see as some of her challenges? Where perhaps does she see some of her strengths playing out? So here again, we talk to the what and the why, and really the 360 being representative of data in a moment in time. And often we're not focusing on each and every one of the scores that we see throughout the report, but more a case of gleaning some real insight into any overarching themes or any consistent patterns emerging in the data, and to really be able to embrace and be open to the feedback in order to be able to articulate a very bespoke, targeted plan. So let's have a look at Sarah's Hogan personality profile. On the screen now, you'll be seeing her flash report. So a reminder that this is really just the 2-page executive summary of all 3 of the Hogan personality inventories. Here we just introduced this as going through the, very high level. These are the 3 different inventories. We've got the bright side in yellow, we've got the dark side in red. That's under stress and pressure, or apathy and boredom. And then we've got the values, motives, preferences in blue. So in the debrief, we're going to be working through a very in-depth interpretation, making inferences across the 3 inventories, alluding occasionally to some of the subscales where we see, where we see relevant sort of patterns emerging in some of those as well. So really just the red and the yellow inventories being the behavioral, the 2 behavioral, the more behavioral, and the blue being more of that inside of personality in terms of what's driving Sarah, what's getting her out of bed in the morning. So let's start by drilling into the HPI. And here you'll see Sarah scored a moderate 48 on the adjustment scale. Adjustment at the very high end being a strong indicator of resilience, emotional regulation, good composure, quite calm, quite even tempered. And on the low end of adjustment, a little bit more of that adrenaline energy, that anxiousness, that urgency that might be on display. So here, Sarah really in that average range on adjustment. Similarly, average range on ambition, 49. So here we'll start looking at the subscales in a moment, but certainly moderate ambition, a little bit more openness to followship, as opposed to very high ambition. That's where that real leadership capability, competitiveness, drive comes in. Lower scores on ambition, a little bit more likely to be a team player and open to others taking the lead. Sociability is your typical introversion, extroversion indicator. Here we see Sarah on the lower side of sociability, so possibly a little more private, a little bit more introverted, a little bit more likely to favor sort of smaller networks, more intimate relationships. Interpersonal sensitivity on the 38th percentile here as well, in that sort of moderate range. I often find this one correlates really well with one's communication style. People at the high end of interpersonal sensitivity, you can kind of feel that warmth, that empathy. They've got kind of a softer communication style, very diplomatic, very tactful, versus at the low end of interpersonal sensitivity, potentially a lot more direct, a lot more transparent, a lot more blunt in some cases, in terms of, calling a spade a spade. Prudence on the 51st percentile, so here in the average sort of moderate range as well. So likely to, be quite, to be quite reliable, quite conscientious, following processes, policies, systems, those sorts of things, in between somebody at the very high end, very detailed, very methodical, at the very low end, a little bit more bigger picture, more abstract, conceptual. Her highest score was inquisitive on the 89th percentile, and this is where we see quite a bit of that curiosity. Not surprising when we unpack this in terms of her really wanting to understand the why. Why do things work the way they do? And being an engineer, a pretty strong sort of correlation there. And learning approach, nothing here to do with IQ. This is about preferred learning styles. And here we see Sarah at the lower end of learning approach, talking to her motivation around the more practical learning style, hands-on, show me what to do, let me get my hands dirty, very pragmatic in terms of learning style. So if we then unpack this in a little bit more depth, Rashik, looking at the subscale information, this sort of brings a little bit more richness in some cases to that overall primary scale. So looking at adjustment here, we notice that the first three, which are empathy, not anxious, and no guilt, Hogan talks to those as internal churn. So here we see Sarah's not, doesn't have a lot of that internal anxiousness. So therefore not necessarily anxious, but in the external churn element, we see a lower subscale score on even tempered, suggesting that at times we might actually see a little of that frustration above the line. In ambition, here we see, some good self-confidence coming through in that subscale, but only 1 out of the 4 bricks endorsed on leadership, talking a little bit there to that sort of a little bit more comfort in fellowship. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but actually that identity being 1 out of 4 was something that Sarah and I were able to unpack in quite some detail in the coaching program, where, some of her challenges were around what does a career pathway look like? And lower scores on identity can often be reflective of somebody who's not 100% clear on some of the career choices or the where to or the purpose piece from here. I'm looking at sociability. So interestingly here, subscales suggest that Sarah's quite social, doesn't mind parties, doesn't mind crowds, but certainly, shying away from the spotlight with that really low exhibitionistic subscale score. Interpersonal sensitivity, quite interesting there in terms of we are seeing a bit of that strong caring subscale come through. So there is some empathy there, even though the overall interpersonal sensitivity score was moderate. And then that no hostility, which was one Sarah and I unpacked in terms of, letting go, not holding on to grudges and not, ruminating on things for longer than one or two. Prudence, we see that high mastery, which is very consistent with some of the informal feedback that she has had around sort of that strong work ethic, very hard worker. But then you see a little bit of that independence in terms of a little bit more of that sort of loner coming through in the lower, not autonomous subscales. Curious, but not overly creative. So you see that high degree of curiosity. We're not surprised by that high science ability subscale, and a little bit lower in terms of that generating ideas, sort of lending itself to a little bit more practical in terms of ideas generation. So there's often a lot of richness in the subscale sets, and I would encourage you, those of you on the call who don't necessarily sort of explore those in a little bit more depth, sort of start using that as an additional insight. So moving on to the Hogan Development Survey, we know that there's slightly different range scores when we're looking at the HDS. So Sarah under stress and pressure, or apathy and boredom. And really, I often find that this is, where the rubber hits the road in most cases. And often these can be the sort of the early insights in terms of actually articulating one's development plan. So here we see that Sarah has 2 derailers. Anything 90% and above is deemed to be high risk or a red flag or a derailer. In reserved and diligent. She also has 2 in the moderate risk range, which is between 70 and the 90th percentile, as in skeptical and leisurely. And what we often look at is single digit scores as well, which we do have a cheat sheet for those of you who are interested, which represents the definitions of low watchouts, as in single figure scores, as well as some of the red flag behavioral indicators that may show up under stress and pressure. So we'd look at the bold, colorful, and imaginative as potentially the absence of a strength, as opposed to on the other side of the scale being overplayed strengths. So here, that excitable, we may, with that adjustment score of Sarah's, that's possibly where we may see a little bit of that frustration coming through, a little bit of that irritability or impatience. That high skeptical, Certainly somebody who can be a little on the mistrusting side, I imagine at times, a little bit nitpicky, a little bit critical. Often people with high skeptical do present with a little bit of a negative sort of mindset at times as well. Low caution, she's comfortable making quite confident decisions quite quickly. And that high reserved is really going to be one to focus on in the coaching in terms of it being at the very high risk end, where it's likely that under stress and pressure, here Sarah may become a little more aloof, may become a little more introverted, may become actually a little more direct, a little bit more blunt in communication style, and a little bit less approachable. That high leisurely, I often find this is one that's not, overtly observed necessarily, and it can sometimes point to a little bit of sort of private irritability in terms of one, maybe working to their own agenda or being a little passive aggressive. Below bold, at times we might want to, work with Sarah to unpack that in terms of, does she have to dial that up on occasion to perhaps show a little bit more leadership on issues, be a little more assertive, be a little bit more confident in having a voice? And then mischievous, not a huge risk taker, so certainly sort of not testing the limits. Low colorful for Sarah, that correlated really well with what we saw in the HPI in terms of that really low exhibitionistic. So certainly, Sarah not favoring the limelight, not favoring the spotlight, not an attention seeker by any means. And there's the low imaginative again, very pragmatic in terms of ideas generation and strategic thinking. So a lot more pragmatic than, than infinite possibilities and ideas and being very eccentric on the high end of that. Diligence on the 94th. So here, another really strong scale in that high risk range, which we explore in the coaching context. Really high diligence scores being there being a risk of real perfectionism, very high standards for self and others, potentially a bit of micromanaging in there, and really a lot of sort of into the weeds, into the detail. And then dutiful, also, creeping up to the moderate risk. There's a sense here that Sarah can be perhaps a little accommodating at times, quite compliant, certainly some respect for hierarchy in that one as well, and wanting, for the most part, people to see her favorably. So already here, we're starting to get an impression of some of those perhaps less desirable behaviors that, if not well managed with some good practical strategies, may actually rise above that waterline. Jumping now into her MVPI. So looking at, what's driving her, what are some of her strong values? We're looking firstly at, her recognition score. And here again, really low on the 4th percentile. We're getting a real theme across her profile of, shying away from spotlight, being sort of a quiet achiever, under the radar, not looking for that overt praise as one on the high end of that one would be. Power, on the 22nd percentile, there is a bit of that followship again. That's let somebody else take the lead. That real sort of, motivation around not always wanting to take the lead. Hedonism, where it is quite formal in style, quite serious about work, which played out in her strong work ethic. Lower altruism, really around that strong self-reliance. And then affiliation, interestingly, her highest, which in terms of the subscales, which we'll have a quick look at, really showed a strong motivation in a workplace context for her to connect with people. Collaboration, team player came through strongly there. Tradition is really that, sense of strong values and beliefs, that integrity piece. Security was lowish, so really not overly motivated by, too much of that predictability and stability and sort of risk aversity that we see at the high end of that one. It wasn't all about the dollar for Sarah, so certainly lower on commerce, not really motivated by, crunching numbers in spreadsheets and, commerciality and profitability and all things generally business and finance, and a very well balanced view in terms of the decision-making cluster, which was the aesthetics and the science, playing out at 60 and 59. So certainly some moderate values and motives, but for the most part, quite a lot of flexibility around these for Sarah. Looking at the subscales, so here, what we often find quite useful for the individual is looking specifically at the occupational preferences, which talk to the individual's workplace preferences. And here you'll see really no endorsement for Sarah in terms of that occupational preference for recognition or hedonism, which just sort of magnifies that value around modesty and having a very disciplined approach to work, and two very high indicators on occupational preferences, as in maxed out on tradition and science, really they sort of elevated that motivation around established processes with a very evidence-based decision. So most of you are super comfortable with the Hogan personality inventories. And so, at this point, we are going great. So now Sarah has this real enhanced self-awareness around likely work behaviors. She's got some insight into her leadership strengths and the areas to watch out for. But the missing piece in the puzzle is actually having some clear sight of how others are perceiving her leadership effectiveness and work and impact in a workplace context. So this is only half the picture. This is only really one piece of the puzzle, and how valuable would it be to then take this to the next level in terms of gathering this 360 data to really support Sarah's understanding of the public perception and her workplace reputation and brand. So let's have a quick look at her 360. So in terms of the report layout, very neatly structured. You've got the 4 sections, the 50 Likert scale response items. You've got the strengths and opportunities table. You've got the free text questions, and you've got the development plan. Here, the next slide, we see where the rubber hits the road. So here we are drawn to Sarah's overall score, and this is the average of all 16 of her raters, excluding her own self-rating. And this puts her between the 50th and 75th percentile of that benchmark scoring. So respectable, but of course always room to move. And there we see the leadership model that underpins the 360, very simplistic, but very impactful in terms of above the line looking at EQ in self and relationship management, and below the line looking at IQ as in working in and on the business. Left hand side as in self-management and working in the business are more your managerial competencies, whereas on the right, when we're looking at relationship management and working on the business, those are more your leader-like competencies. So here, the next couple of pages of the report present in a table all 50 of the standard items in the 360 ranked from Sarah's highest score all the way through to her lowest score. And this is the average of all 16 of her raters. And there you'll see on the right-hand side her average score versus the global average. And at this point, all we're really interested in is taking a deeper dive into the top 10 or 15 items to see if there's an initial theme or any sort of consistent items that may be presented, giving us an initial impression of what Sarah's strengths might be. So having a look at those, and anybody would love to I'd love to see some comments in the chat around any strong themes that you might be able to pick out from those top 10 or 15 items. Doing a little quick sort of thematic analysis, here we notice in green that there's a really strong theme around Sarah's ability to hold others accountable. She's got very high expectations for performance, and she's holding people accountable to the organization's values as well as completing their work. You've also got her there as a 6.1 when it comes to challenging poor performance, and then regularly providing guidance and feedback. There's also a theme in the blue there, which talks to, her work ethic, as well as, efficiency in terms of time management and directing activities. So just an initial impression as we build on the other sections of the 360. Looking then at the bottom, 10 items. So here again, we're looking from the 50th item up to, say, the 40th or the 35th. And here again, really looking to see if there's any themes emerging in terms of what might be some of the things that present as opportunities for Sarah. Here again, doing a quick thematic analysis, you'll see in the light yellow, there's certainly a bit of a theme there around the possible opportunity for Sarah to improve morale and to work a little bit harder in terms of creating a positive environment. In the dark yellow, you're looking at, theme around the need to be a little more strategic, have a little bit more forward focus, think a little bit more about the long term. And then the red and purple really just highlighting that emerging theme around a need to enhance some of that EQ. So, really pushing in to the EQ space. In terms of, I'm hoping that a lot of you are going to start making some intuitive connections and seeing some of the really strong combinations that are playing out here. And some of those would be around, the purple, excellent people skills there, and never rude and abrasive and always friendly, warm and thoughtful. Those really talk to, the interpersonal sensitivity, that high reserved you can see playing out there a little bit. When we look at skeptical, we can see there that possibly perhaps a little bit of that negativity and a little bit of that fault finding and possibly sometimes being quite critical may have an impact on the positive working environment and the morale. And certainly with that very high diligence, we can see that at times Sarah might be too in the weeds and really needs to have a little bit more of that helicopter view as well. But let's quickly take a quick look at the rater groups. So as part of the report, this is really just an executive summary of the leadership domains, as in self-management and relationship management, with their relative sub-themes. And here we're seeing the various rater categories. And here it's about looking at any, are there any significant differences between the various raters and self-scores? Because this can really also paint a very good picture of how the individual is managing both up, down, sideways, and certainly some real richness in unpacking that with Sarah through the debrief process. Here, just highlighting again that her lowest overall score was in that resilience piece in self-management and in that people skills sub-theme under relationship management. And looking at the next slide, which is the in and on the business, here again, we see very strongly in terms of the sixes we see in the capability and efficiency sub-themes. So, 6 and above we deem to be real sort of gold star, gold medal. So very, very strong in terms of technical ability coming through there. And then accountability, the strongest, which is building on the theme of what we've seen in terms of working on the business. The next part of the report actually, I believe, is so valuable because here we're taking a deep dive into strengths and opportunities, and you get visibility to the strengths and the opportunities tables, which are gold. So here we've gone out to Sarah's raters and we've asked them to pick her top 4 strengths based on a list of 30 items. And they get to pick her top 4 strengths. Whatever they pick as her number 1 strength gets 4 points, second strength 3 points, then 2 and 1 points. And that's what makes up that overall total score on the right-hand side. So here for Sarah, interestingly, the top strengths that came out was first ranked with strong leadership skills, then technical ability, good planning, challenges poor performance, and high performer. This was a really cool one to unpack in the coaching process because we were able to connect the strong leadership skills with some of those unique strengths that you see in this person knows her stuff. She's solid with technical ability. She's good at planning, fabulous, and thinks ahead. She can actually challenge poor performance as well as drives for results. So we unpack that as the underpinning items to then be able to, have that strong leadership skills as her number one. Looking then at the opportunities to improve table, here we see very strong score, total score of 21, stop taking on too much and spreading yourself too thin. Followed by motivate others and improve morale, improve people and interpersonal skills, and be more strategic and visionary. So really spotlighting those top 4 as things that we would possibly take into a development plan to be able to really build some practical strategies around how do we shift the dial. Here, sorry,
Lee,
Rashik.
if I could ask, Lee, any connections with the Hogan personality profile that come through with these opportunities?
Great question. And there's some very strong correlations for Sarah. And in this case, stop taking on too much and spreading yourself too thin would be very reflective of that high diligence. So really a doer, doing everything. And also quite high dutiful. So not only a doer, but a pleaser as well. So, taking on a really high workload and potentially, with that high diligence, not delegating that efficiently, which we see as an opportunity as well, not empowering others to do work that would also probably influence the morale and the positive environment. So a lot of connections there in terms of what we see in sort of top 4. And finally, the final section of the 360, which is the bit that I think really brings the data to life for the individual. And most people love this section the most because they're getting to read actual verbatim, unedited comments from all their various rater groups. And often there can be some really there's some real gems in there, some really good insights when people actually give quite robust and quite instructive examples of where some of these behaviors may be playing out. So this was the question around, please describe this person's strengths. And I often get people to take a highlighter and actually highlight the words or the descriptors that may be repeating themselves, because that in itself is a bit of a thematic analysis. So here you can clearly see some real validation off the back of what we've already explored in the 360 and the connection to personality. Here, hardworking is the mastery, organized and efficient is what we see in some of the subscales in the personality. Planning, execution, so real technical ability there. Looking at the next one around describing this person's opportunities to improve. Here sort of no surprises in terms of the build of the 360, as well as having debriefed the personality. There it is in red. Delegate more, build those interpersonal skills. Here comes a little bit of the frustration and the lack of patience coming through. So there's kind of the high reserved. There's a little bit of that excitability. There's a little bit of that diligence coming in there as well. And then finally, the final question is around, are there any strengths being overused? Overused strength becomes something that may trip the individual up in order for them to get along with others, to get ahead. And here we see consistent theme around that quite blunt and direct nature that may present, particularly when Sarah's under stress and pressure. Bang, out comes the high reserved. Not delegating. Here again is that micromanagement and the delegation piece, and then a little bit of that, need to really get that emotional regulation under control as well. So, really valuable insights for Sarah in both understanding the below the waterline and the private Sarah, having the public Sarah now unpacked as well, and then really driving to get to, the core 3 or 4 development opportunities that are going to shift the dial for Sarah in terms of overall enhancement of leadership style and impact. So bringing it all together, Rashik, you know, in terms of where Sarah and I landed, it was that real reinforcement of strengths. Let's not forget about the strengths. Let's not just skip over the strengths to be able to leverage what we need to work on, but certainly understanding, you know, what to keep in terms of, you know, that holding people accountable, being planful, being organized, driving for results, but then landing on those 4 development opportunities, which were very clear in both data sets around delegation, building relationships, managing emotions effectively, and really enhancing that communication style. So, you know, over the course of the coaching program, it's really about supporting Sarah to be able to develop some practical strategies, embed some behavioral choices that are ultimately going to shift the dial on her effectiveness and impact. And that's when, you know, giving an individual an opportunity to do a repeat 360 becomes such a valuable exercise, because it's so rewarding as an individual to see where you have made progress and where you have improved, and to have that validated evidence-based measure of, you know, all the effort and energy you've put into this can be super rewarding for the individual. So, you know, at that point, Rashik, I want to hand back to you.
Yeah, Lee, before we go on to other questions, I have a question. It's really interesting to see, especially some of that diligence and dutiful coming through in the 360. It seems to be a very strong connection, and it reinforces the profiles. But what happens when the personality profile and the 360 are not aligned, and if there are elements that are seemingly conflicting between one and the other?
Rashik, that's a great question, and you're so right. In this case, for Sarah, it was really just validation. You know, there was such good alignment between personality and 360, and you know, how she saw herself and her own self-awareness was pretty evident over the course of the program. But certainly there are instances where we see an individual with a really tricky and somewhat challenging personality profile, but then you see their 360 results and you go, like, how do we reconcile this? You know, they come out with a 6.1 or a 6.2 when it comes to the perception of others. And 9 times out of 10, it comes back to that real self-awareness and one's ability to really self-manage and make some of those intentional behavioral choices to be able to show up in a way that's super effective and impactful. And invariably, those individuals who have that level of self-awareness and who have consciously made those behavioral choices will often say it is quite exhausting. But I've learned how to manage this in a way that I'm showing up to be the best version that I can be. And you see the reverse happening as well. So and that in itself is a great insight, and so useful to be able to unpack that with the individual, to be able to reconcile, you know, what's happening here and what might be at play.
Thanks, Lee. I've got a quick one that I'll take, and then a really interesting one that's come through, which I'll give to you. But the quick one, Jen asked, are the strengths open-ended items, or do raters select these? So there's both. So there are selectable tables for the strengths and opportunities where the raters pick their ranking from 1 to 4 in terms of the top strengths and the top opportunities. And those are predefined and based upon a lot of research. But there are then also open-ended questions around strengths and opportunities and overused strengths as well. So the raters have opportunities to respond in both formats. And so that gives a real holistic opportunity to get that feedback. A question, we've had many questions come through, but one question I wanted to pass on to you, Lee, is do you debrief both tools and do development planning in one session, or do you do personality first in one session and then reference it later again when doing the 360 debrief?
Thanks, Rashik. A great question. And the answer to that is, you know, most coaches have, you know, their own style and their own comfort in, you know, how they tend to want to structure the debriefs and the sessions. But from my experience and our recommendation would be to debrief personality first, and to not do them both in one session. It's really data overload. It can be quite overwhelming to be getting that much data and to actually be able to make sense of it or incubate and reflect. So typically it would be a 90-minute Hogan personality debrief up front, and that would be the starting point to be able to give the individual that level of self-awareness, get them to reflect on some of their innate personality preferences. What are their leadership strengths? What are some of the things that they feel they may need to watch out for? And then in a second or third session, bring in and introduce the 360, allowing enough time in a 6-session engagement to be able to unpack the 360 very, in depth, so that you're able to then at that point combine both insights into a very bespoke development plan. So it's usually personality in session 1 with a bit of reflection and an initial sense of what's working and what perhaps is not, and then session 2 or 3 the 360, and then consolidation into a well articulated plan.
Thanks, Lee. And that question was from Louise. So thank you for that question, Louise. There's a question here from Celeb. What is the recommended length of time between the first and second 360? Look, it really depends. We say 12 months is a good repeat cycle. However, depending on the individual's needs and the organizational needs, it can be a little bit more regular than that. But definitely, on a 12-month cycle is a very popular cycle that we see being used in the marketplace, and a very helpful point to repeat it after about a year or so. A question from Sane. Apologies if that's not the correct pronunciation, but Lee, I might throw this to you. How long typically is the coaching process when using this combined 360 and personality approach?
Rashik, our preference would be a 6-session engagement, because what we're really after is sustainable behavioral change. And we know, and our experience tells us, that can take some time. Often we don't have the luxury of the full 6 sessions, and in some cases, it may be 4 or 5, but certainly if you've got both data sets, you want an absolute minimum of 3, plus perhaps the opportunity to check in and re-engage post that as well. But ideally, 6 is the recommendation.
Great, thanks, Lee. And a really interesting question from Eliza. Which tool would you start with when you start working with a leadership team that want to develop leadership capability? Lee, I might get your input on that one.
Look, from my perspective, it depends. It depends on the maturity, the leadership maturity of that team. How well do they know one another? How closely do they work together? What is the level of trust amongst those individuals? And ideally, we'd probably start with personality, to my earlier point, as in a slightly sort of softer entry, if you like, and potentially a little less confrontational, depending on what's coming through from the 360s. But certainly, that would be at the discretion of the facilitator or the coach in really getting a very thorough understanding of context and what are we actually trying to achieve by doing one or the other, and what defines a good sort of starting point in that context.
Thanks, Lee. And just to add to that as well, in this hypothetical scenario, it would be a good opportunity to consider the high-performing team assessment as well, because it is, again, everyone in the team will answer questions about the team as its own entity, and you get that insight across the domains of performance and culture. But it's also another psychologically safe way to provide some feedback and get some insights across the entire team, because it is all de-identified, and it can really prompt some very productive conversations. So, we obviously haven't spoken too much about the team assessment today, but in this particular question, I think that would be a very worthwhile consideration to make as well as part of the overall program.
Really good call out, Rashik.
Thank you. I'm just seeing, I don't think I can see any more questions. I think we might, well, we are at 1 minute to the hour, so unless there were any other questions, thank you everyone for your time. And oh, we wanted to give a quick update on Sarah's progress before everyone jumps up. Apologies, Lee. Did you want to quickly talk through the outcomes before everyone leaves?
In 1 minute, I
Yes.
was very pleased to report on Sarah's progress. She was super open to the feedback. She, she already had a sense that maybe her interpersonal style may not be working with some of her stakeholders. She really acknowledged the fact that occasionally that emotional regulation piece got the better of her, and really recognized the need for change in terms of wanting to move her career forward, and career succession and new pathways for her. So through the course of the coaching program, she was actually able to become a little bit more vulnerable and lean into the data and share some of that with some of her more tricky stakeholders, and in particular with one colleague who she didn't necessarily have a good relationship with, but through the process was able to, really shift that communication style to show a little bit more of that empathy and that sort of consultation style with one of her colleagues that ended up in a very solid relationship. So that's me.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lee. Thank you, everyone, for your time. We hope you found this session interesting and insightful. If there were any questions we didn't get to, we will definitely reach out to answer those. And please do reach out to us if you have any further questions after this session, or if you'd like to explore using any of our tools or services. Thanks again. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.